Imagine the sky turning pitch black in the middle of the day, not from an eclipse, not from a passing storm, but from something far more terrifying, something rising from the Earth itself. That's exactly what happened on April 10th, 1815, on the Indonesian island of Sumbawa. Mount Tambora, a colossal volcano that had been quietly rumbling for years, finally reached its breaking point. And when it didn't just erupt. It detonated with the force of 1,000 Hiroshima-sized atomic bombs, unleashing a cataclysm that would reshape the entire planet. The explosion was so loud it was heard over 200 miles away. That's more than the distance from New York to Miami. The ash plume shot 25 miles into the sky, punching straight through the stratosphere. And within hours, day had turned to night across the region as a suffocating blanket of volcanic debris swallowed the sun. But here's what makes Tambora truly terrifying. The immediate destruction, the pyroclastic flows, the tsunamis, the collapsing buildings, was only the beginning. What followed was something no one saw coming, a global climate catastrophe. Crops failed across Europe and North America, famine spread, disease outbreaks swept through the weakened populations. The year 1816 became known as the year without a summer, and millions of lives were forever altered by a volcano most of them had never even heard of. By the time it was over, Mount Tambora had claimed an estimated 71,000 lives directly, with countless more perishing in the famines and epidemics that followed. It remains the deadliest volcanic eruption in recorded human history, and yet, compared to disasters like Pompeii or Krakatoa, most people today have never heard of it. This is the story of how a single mountain on a remote Indonesian island triggered a cascade of devastation that circled the globe, how tens of thousands died in minutes, and how millions more suffered for years afterward. This is Mount Tambora, the eruption that changed the world. To understand why Tambora exploded with such unimaginable force, you first need to understand where it sits on the map. The island of Sumbawa lies in the heart of the Indonesian archipelago, a region that belongs to one of the most geologically violent zones on Earth, the Ring of Fire. This horseshoe-shaped belt stretches nearly 25,000 miles around the Pacific Basin, and it's responsible for about 90% of the world's earthquakes and 75% of its volcanic eruptions. It's where the Earth's massive tectonic plates collide, grind, and slip beneath one another in a slow but relentless dance of destruction. And Mount Tambora sits right in the middle of it. Here's how it works. Beneath Indonesia, the Indo-Australian plate is slowly diving under the Eurasian plate in what geologists call a subduction zone. As one plate slides beneath the other, it gets pushed deep into the Earth's mantle, where intense heat and pressure begin to melt the rock. That molten rock, magma, rises toward the surface. And when it finds a weak point in the crust, it builds a volcano. Tambora was one of those weak points. For thousands of years, magma accumulated in a massive chamber beneath the mountain, building pressure like a bomb waiting to detonate. The mountain grew taller and more imposing with each passing century, eventually reaching an estimated 14,000 feet, one of the highest peaks in the Indonesian archipelago. But pressure doesn't build forever. Eventually, something has to give. In the years leading up to 1815, Tambora started showing signs that something was wrong. Minor rumblings echoed from deep within the earth. Smoke began billowing from the summit, drifting across the sky in ominous gray plumes. The people living on Sumbawa noticed. They had lived in the shadow of this mountain for generations. They knew it was alive, but no one could have predicted what was coming. Then came April 5th, 1815. The mountain roared to life with a series of powerful explosions that sent ash shooting miles into the sky. The blasts were loud enough to be heard hundreds of miles away. Villagers fled in terror. Ships at sea changed course. It seemed like the worst had arrived, but it hadn't. Not even close. What happened on April 5th was just a release valve, a warning shot. The magma chamber beneath Tambora was still intact, still pressurized, still building towards something far more catastrophic. The mountain had announced itself to the world, but it wasn't finished yet. 5 days later, everything would change. The pressure that had been accumulating for millennia was about to find its release in the most violent volcanic eruption in recorded human history. And when it did, the entire planet would feel the consequences. April 10th, 1815. Just before 7 p.m. local time, Mount Tambora tore itself apart. The magma chamber's roof, weakened by days of preliminary explosions, finally collapsed under its own weight. What followed was not merely an eruption, it was an annihilation. The mountain detonated with a force equivalent to 1,000 Hiroshima-sized atomic bombs, releasing energy that had been building for thousands of years in a single catastrophic instant. The explosion was heard over 200 miles away. People in Sumatra thought they were hearing distant cannon fire. British soldiers stationed hundreds of miles from Sumbawa believed a battle had broken out somewhere beyond the horizon. No one imagined that what they were hearing was a mountain disintegrating. Within minutes, an ash column punched 25 miles into the sky, blasting straight through the troposphere and into the stratosphere. The plume spread outward like a dark umbrella, blocking out the sun across the entire region. Day turned to absolute night. Not twilight, not dusk. Complete, impenetrable darkness, the kind where you cannot see your hand in front of your face. And then came the pyroclastic flows. Superheated avalanches of gas, ash, and rock cascaded down Tambora's slopes at speeds exceeding 100 miles per hour. Everything in their path was incinerated instantly. Villages that had stood for generations vanished in seconds. Forests were flattened and buried. The flows reached temperatures hot enough to boil water on contact, and they moved so fast that no one caught in their path had any chance of escape. The destruction didn't stop at the shoreline. When the pyroclastic material hit the ocean, it triggered massive tsunamis that radiated outward, slamming into coastal communities on neighboring islands. Entire fishing villages were swept away before anyone understood what was happening. The eruption continued for days. Wave after wave of explosions sent fresh columns of ash into the sky. An estimated 160 cubic kilometers of volcanic material was ejected from the mountain, roughly 14 times more than the 1980 eruption of Mount St. Helens. The sheer volume is almost impossible to comprehend. When the smoke finally began to clear, the mountain that had once stood 14,000 feet tall was unrecognizable. The top third of Tambora was simply gone. In its place was a massive caldera, a volcanic crater 4 miles wide and over 3,000 feet deep. The mountain had hollowed itself out from the inside. On Sumbawa alone, an estimated 10,000 people died in the immediate eruption. Pyroclastic flows, tsunamis, collapsing buildings, and suffocation from the ash claimed lives faster than anyone could count. Entire communities were erased from existence, buried under feet of volcanic debris. But as devastating as those first hours were, they represented only a fraction of the death toll to come. The ash that Tambora had thrown into the stratosphere was now circling the globe, carrying with it consequences that no one could yet imagine. The eruption was over. The catastrophe was just beginning. The ash cloud that Tambora threw into the stratosphere didn't stay over Indonesia. It spread, carried by high-altitude winds, sulfuric aerosols, and volcanic particles dispersed across the entire planet, forming an invisible veil between the Earth and the Sun. Within months, that veil began to block sunlight on a global scale. The effects were devastating. In 1816, summer never arrived. Across Europe and North America, temperatures plummeted during what should have been the warmest months of the year. Frost struck in June. Snow fell in July and August. Farmers who had planted their crops expecting normal growing conditions watched in horror as their fields withered and died under gray, sunless skies. The year became known as the year without a summer. And for millions of people who had never heard of Mount Tambora, who had no idea that a volcano on the other side of the world had just reshaped the atmosphere, it felt like the end of days. Crop failures spread like a plague. In New England, corn and wheat harvests collapsed. In Europe, grain prices skyrocketed as food became scarce. Families who had been comfortable just a year earlier suddenly found themselves unable to afford bread. The hungry grew desperate. The desperate grew violent. But starvation was only the beginning. Without adequate food, livestock began dying in massive numbers. Horses, cattle, and sheep perished from lack of feed, crippling transportation and eliminating crucial sources of protein for already weakened populations. The agricultural backbone of entire nations was breaking. Then came the disease. Malnourished bodies have weakened immune systems, and weakened immune systems cannot fight infection. Outbreaks of typhus swept through Europe, killing tens of thousands. Cholera spread through contaminated water supplies as sanitation systems collapsed under the strain of crisis. Dysentery claimed the lives of children and the elderly in staggering numbers. Communities that had survived the famine succumbed to the epidemics that followed. The economic fallout was equally catastrophic. With agriculture in ruins, trade patterns collapsed. Nations scrambled to secure food imports, driving prices even higher. Unemployment soared, poverty spread. The foundations of early 19th century society, already fragile, began to crack under the pressure. Social unrest followed inevitably. Bread riots erupted across Europe. Rebellions broke out in regions where governments failed to provide relief. Historians have traced waves of political upheaval, migration, and even cultural movements to the desperation born from Tambora's aftermath. The Romantic and Gothic literary movements, steeped in darkness and despair, emerged from a world that had witnessed nature's terrifying power firsthand. And here's what makes this truly haunting. The people suffering through 1816 had no explanation for what was happening. They didn't know about the eruption. They couldn't connect the cold, the failed harvests, the disease, and the chaos to a distant volcano. To them, it simply seemed like the world was ending for reasons beyond human understanding. In a way, they were right. Mount Tambora had demonstrated something profound. Our planet is one interconnected system, and no corner of it is truly safe from what happens elsewhere. Behind every statistic, there were real people. Families who woke up that April morning with no idea their world was about to end. Farmers who had tended the same land for generations. Children who would never grow old. When we talk about 71,000 deaths, it's easy to lose sight of the individual lives behind that number. But the survivors left behind accounts that bring this tragedy into devastating focus. A Dutch colonist stationed in the region wrote about the moments the eruption began. He described a sudden darkness descending without warning, turning midday into midnight. Thunderous sounds echoed across the landscape as if the mountains themselves were collapsing. The air grew thick with ash and smoke, making every breath a struggle. In his words, there was raw terror, the uncertainty of not knowing whether he would live to see another dawn. Then there's the account of a young woman named Siti. Her writings survive as one of the most heartbreaking testimonies of the disaster. She lost everything: her family, her home, her entire village. In the aftermath, she wandered through a landscape blanketed in gray ash, searching for food in a land where nothing could grow. Hunger became her constant companion. Yet despite the sorrow that saturates her words, there's something else woven through them. Determination, a will to survive, a refusal to let the mountain claim her spirit along with everything else it had taken. Not all witnesses were on land. A British sea captain sailing through the Indonesian archipelago at the time of the eruption left behind a chilling account of his own. His ship encountered a sea of floating pumice, volcanic rock so thick on the water's surface that it slowed his vessel to a crawl. At night, an eerie orange glow lit the horizon, a haunting reminder of the devastation unfolding on distant shores. Even hundreds of miles from Tambora, the eruption's reach was inescapable. These stories matter because they remind us that disasters are not abstract events measured only in cubic kilometers of ash or dollars of damage. They are experienced by human beings, people with names, with families, with hopes that were extinguished in an instant. Siti's hunger was real. The colonists' fear was real. The captain's unease as his ship pushed through a dead sea of stone was real. The official death toll from the immediate eruption stands at approximately 10,000 on Sumbawa and the surrounding islands. But when you factor in the famines, the diseases, and the slow starvation that followed it in the year without a summer, estimates climb as high as 100,000 lives lost worldwide. Some historians believe even that number is conservative. Mount Tambora didn't just kill people in 1815. It haunted the world for years afterward, its consequences rippling outward in ways that took decades to fully understand. And for those who lived through it, those who survived the fire, the darkness, and the endless hunger, the memory of that mountain never truly faded. Since Mount Tambora's eruption in 1815, the world has learned hard lessons from that catastrophe. We've developed sophisticated monitoring technologies capable of detecting the slightest seismic tremors beneath volcanic mountains. We've built early warning systems. We've created evacuation protocols and disaster response strategies that would have been unthinkable 2 centuries ago. But perhaps the most important lesson Tambora taught us has nothing to do with volcanoes at all. It's about interconnection, about how a single event on a remote Indonesian island can ripple outward, crossing oceans, toppling economies, starving millions who never even felt the ground shake. In 1815, farmers in Vermont had no idea why their crops were dying. Families in Ireland didn't understand why summer never came. They had no way of knowing that a mountain on the other side of the planet had thrown so much ash into the sky that the sun itself was dimmed. Today, as we face the mounting challenges of climate change, Tambora stands as a stark warning. It shows us exactly what happens when global temperatures shift dramatically in a short period, how quickly food systems collapse, how fast disease spreads through weakened populations, how easily social order unravels when survival becomes uncertain. We cannot prevent volcanic eruptions. We cannot stop the Earth from doing what it has always done. But we can prepare. We can build resilient systems. We can listen to the warnings the planet gives us, because Mount Tambora gave warnings for years before it finally exploded. The question was whether anyone was paying attention. More than 2 centuries later, the mountain still stands, smaller now, with a 4-mile-wide crater where its peak once reached toward the sky. The forests have returned. Life has reclaimed the slopes. But the lesson remains carved into the caldera itself. Nature operates on a scale we can barely comprehend, and our survival depends on respecting that power. The only question is whether we'll remember that lesson before the next Tambora awakens.